I'm very happy to introduce the next session, which will be a fireside chat entitled, How Can We Improve Online Learning? With Maxwell Bigman, a doctoral candidate at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, and John Mitchell, the Mary and Gordon Crary Family Professor of Computer Science at Stanford University. And they will be interviewed by Christina Prkic, Director of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Thank you, and I'll enjoy listening to your next session.
Well, I'm very excited to be here, and thank you so much. And excited to close day 2 here of Project Ascendance. What a great day! Talking about actually with John and Maxwell about a question that I think most of us a year ago today would not have thought we would be asking ourselves every day, or be the dominant subject of virtual family and friend dinners, which is how can we improve online learning? So it's a really exciting time to be talking about this, and we have 2 great guests with us. So we're going to jump right in here. And John and Maxwell, thank you again for making some time to chat with us. You both conducted a survey of the online experiences of Stanford's Department of Computer Science early in the spring, and recently revealed those results. So what did you see in the spring, if you want to talk a little bit about those survey findings?
Maybe. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here and the warm introduction. It's a tough act to follow the previous speaker. So I don't know if we'll have a fireside chat, but we'll have some kind of chat here. And so let me start with a little bit of framing, and then Maxwell has a lot to contribute on the specifics and otherwise. I think the main thing that struck me, just at a very high level, was at our university and so many others, everyone dropped everything they were doing and did the best they could to deal with the circumstances. And while the many different institutions had online classes and online programs before, I didn't really hear a widespread claim that we knew how to do what we were doing. It was really a seat of the pants kind of effort. And even in our department and our university, which was heavily involved in the MOOC movement, producing courses that way, we have a number of online degree programs and online programs. Nobody said, oh, that's the solution. Everyone looked for something different that would be comparable to the online classes that students really loved and wanted to do. So that's kind of the framework. And we saw everyone being, huge number of time. Most faculty spent 2x, 3 times as much time as they normally would on their teaching. It wasn't perfect, but there's a huge amount of time commitment, both at our institution and really everywhere that I talked. So that's the context. Maxwell, do you want to say a little bit about what are the categories of things we found and bring that in?
Yeah, and I also wanted to thank everyone for having me here. This is a real fun experience. We talked to a lot of the teachers and just to understand what was going on in the spring term. It was fully online because of the way the timing works for our quarter system. And there were kind of 3 main themes that came out of that work. The first is there was just a lot of experimentation. And as John was saying, that despite all this available content and this history with MOOCs, people still want to try lots of new things. There was a mixture of the synchronous and asynchronous time and how they did grades and exams, student interaction. The second big theme was around student disruption and trying to deal with that. It was a really diverse set of experiences for virtual learners. The loss of those residential resources were really tough, and I think it built a lot of empathy for students on the part of the educators, which is really fantastic. But it also highlighted a lot of inequalities that became a lot more salient in these environments. And that's a continued thing that we're seeing. And the third big theme was just a real expansion of what we call the pedagogical toolbox, and trying out new practices, seeing what works, really being willing to experiment in a way that wasn't there before, with flipped classrooms, with mastery-based learning, with different online tools, and how the core staff gets used. So those are kind of the overarching pieces, and we're happy to talk more about any of them.
Yeah, maybe I comment a little bit on this. 2 things. One, synchronous versus asynchronous. So for people not familiar with that, synchronous means everybody shows up and participates in the class at the same time. Asynchronous is there's a thing that each student can do at their own time. So we tried to make more pre-recorded videos, so as a way to reduce Zoom fatigue and let people come at any time. The second thing, and I think was really the biggest issue for many of us, was students were, comfortably in their dorms on campus, having a good time, having student life. And then they were all shipped off to very, very different kinds of situations. Some went to their family's vacation home in some nice place. Some went back to, much less luxurious living situations. We admit students and bring people to campus from a wide variety of backgrounds, and sending them back was really extremely challenging. We had a lot of civic, unrest during the spring quarter towards the end, and some people were right outside big riots and having trouble with connectivity. So I think one of the things that really happened was we as teachers had to become much more committed to understanding what was happening with our students. Were they safe? Were they able to spend time? Did they have a place they could focus on classes? There were a huge number of challenges around that, and it was a very, very difficult time for many people.
Yeah, that's I mean, that idea of the fatigue. I mean, people were really feeling it, and parents as well, with young children trying to juggle online learning, their own careers. How if we can kind of unpack that a bit more and kind of understand, how in your research, I mean, and what came out of ways to improve that fatigue or combat that fatigue and exhaustion, frankly.
Do you want to comment on that, Maxwell? Or?
Sure. I mean, I think the big piece was just, don't try to make students sit there for a very long time. I think we've all experienced it at this point. Students are no different, and so there's a lot of pre-recorded lectures. They were cut into a lot smaller chunks, and so around 7 minutes is the magic number that we have learned from the MOOC era. And then making the classes a lot more interactive, and asking students to actively participate in a way that a traditional lecture, that's not what happens. And so I think those are the ways in which students are feeling a lot more engaged. When they get opportunities to connect with one another, that's really important to them. Breakout rooms and these small group interactions are a polarizing topic, but for the people who it works for, it's really great. And then it allows for this kind of intimate feel that isn't always there in a big lecture.
So one way to look at that I think applies K-12, post-secondary, in almost any setting, is the class meeting is only a portion of the student's learning experience. We might have a seminar course or a lecture course. Students come to an auditorium or sit around a table for a few hours of the week, but they also have reading, they have study groups with other students, they have problem sets or projects or papers to write, often some sort of interaction with each other. And when we try to cope with this distributed remote learning, we have to think about all of those parts. Yeah. So simply focusing how to present material in a lecture style only gets at a third, a quarter, or less of the nature of the class. And one of the things we've continued to work on and are trying to understand how to do better is, how do we support students meeting other students to find out and talk about questions, finding collaborators for projects, connecting with each other. That's something that students in our surveys seem to value very much. And so I think for anyone looking at their online program or how education can improve for themselves, one big lesson is try to combat Zoom fatigue by breaking up things into a small number of structured hours where everyone's there being interactive, and some other things people can watch. And the other is try to find ways to help your students connect with each other and learn from each other, because that's an important part of any educational experience.
So Maxwell, you mentioned MOOC, and John, you created, for those who don't know, Stanford's first MOOC in, was it 2012? So what is this, pandemic, this experience, how has that made you kind of rethink and examine the entire MOOC environment? You know, what's different about this time?
So maybe just to give credit where credit is due, I built a platform that was used on campus at Stanford and for some experiments, but a few other people launched the first MOOCs by announcing that their Stanford courses were going to be open to everyone. And that got a lot of attention because we're a very selective institution. You know, the tuition is high. It's the same as other private colleges and universities, but it's an expensive thing. So free Stanford courses for all kind of got attention, and it led to some really good things. One of the things I learned out of this, the next 5 or 6 years, I was had a role around Stanford strategy and supporting it there. Everyone really wants more education. I mean, I think that we in education serve only a very small fraction of the need. And that's something I think we can think about now when we see online courses working, or we see promise for some elements of digital tools to scale or improve the quality of education. Really, there's so many unserved or underserved groups, and they can be working professionals, they can be people in the United States, they can be people in other countries. Really, many different segments in different areas are underserved. And so I think that's something I carry over from the MOOC effort. Another thing that's a contrast to something I just mentioned, I think what we did in the MOOC, massive open online course, was open up the lecture class so that you could attend the lectures. And I admit totally to being naive, and many of my colleagues who started companies, I think, wouldn't mind my saying they were naive about some things. We thought that if we opened up Stanford lectures to everybody, that would in some sense feel equivalent to coming to Stanford and being a student there. And part of what we're seeing in this period is that's not the case at all. Just the course meeting or the lecture is only the tip of the iceberg. And if you don't find ways to support students meeting each other, networking, doing meaningful activities that help them understand the material, you haven't really provided a successful educational framework. But I still believe that we should aim to provide more education for more people. That's really, one of my personal aims.
And so in your study, you talk about, and you touched upon it earlier, this idea of beyond being there. And, Maxwell, you spoke about experimentation in teaching. And so what could we, what are some of those things that we could do? I mean, those ideas we can pass on to the teachers, the professors that are here on the call today. What does it mean to be beyond there?
Yeah, so that's a term that comes from the human-computer interaction literature, I believe from the 90s, but I'm a little young, so I'm not exactly sure when it's from. And it's about what can you do that uniquely online that you cannot do in person. So rather than trying to replicate the way that you were teaching in an in-person environment and just kind of port over all of those activities to an online setting, think about, can you think creatively about how you might design learning experiences that take advantage of things that you could do in an online setting? So there are a lot of tools that enable that. I mean, something just like super simple is the fact that in a lecture class, usually nobody asks questions or a couple of people ask questions. And now in the Zoom chat, people can fire off questions as they please, and that creates a more interactive environment. So, that's really small, and that kind of challenges the notion of what you could do. I think, there are tools that allow for social engagement, tools like something called Perusal that allows for engagement with reading. So it's you're adding in comments at your own asynchronous time, but different people are coming and adding that, and the conversation ensues in the text. And that really allows for, when you show up to class, a lot more lively and informed discussion. And that's equally applicable in a history classroom and in a computer science classroom. And so it really does seem to come back to, as John was talking about, the relationships between students and the supports they get and how they're able to learn with each other and from one another and from the course staff. that has to be somewhat more creatively thought about when you don't have the residential resources on campus, or if you're a K-12 teacher, you're not seeing your students every day, especially because building those relationships in online environments are incredibly hard. And it's something that nobody has figured out just yet. We're working on it ourselves, and hoping that there are different creative ways that people are thinking about the course elements and how they can break them up and to achieve the same learning goals that they would in an in-person setting.
Great. So, you mentioned, the kind of active chat you just noted around, Zoom, and we're actually in our own little product experiment at the Fed looking at building out an online learning academy for some of our product managers. And one of the, we're kind of in our own beta testing right now. And what some of the early feedback we're getting is, it's great, we're doing this through Teams, but it's actually kind of creating some like cognitive chaos for people because they're trying to focus on an instructor talking about material, and yet there's a chat session blowing up with comments and questions, and even some of the instructors are actually trying to focus on continuing to give the lecture while also monitoring a chat session. So any kind of tips for those who are in this online learning environment? You're trying to kind of listen, but then you've got and focus on the instructor, but then you've got all of this other, like you said, asynchronous activity happening around you.
So I think one basic thing, and I've seen this over and over again, a tech feature is not the same thing as a pedagogical method. So chat might work well if it's used one way, and it might be completely disruptive if it's used another. So I think what you have to do is step back a minute, ask what you're trying to accomplish, and then set some framework, set some expectations, and try to direct attention in the way that you think is most effective. I also know that there are many different ways that work on this, and so it depends a little bit on the size of the group. If you have 200 people listening, somebody's mind is going to wander, or they're going to be stuck on something. And in their own mind and their own thought process, they're going to need some answer to the question, some way to resolve their confusion before they can catch up. And in that case, asking a question in a chat or on a discussion forum, which we've used in many of our courses, and having that answered by a teaching assistant or another student, that's extremely helpful. If you try to have a conversation between 5 people and they're supposed to be paying attention and they're shopping for shoes or talking about something else, it's totally disruptive. So I mean, basically, it's a simple-minded sounding answer, but basically, try to create the process that you think will be effective. Use the tools that work for that. Set ground rules and try to proceed. But don't fight human nature. You have to make things work for people. I don't know if that's helpful, Maxwell. You have other thoughts? You've taught a lot, spent a lot of time on these things.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll add is that if you have teaching assistants, so if you're at a university, they're very helpful, and you don't just have to use them for grading. So I think being creative and letting them be your eyes and ears can be helpful, and that's not always useful in a K-12 setting. For me, it was when I was teaching high school computer science, I spent a lot of time said, here's the task, and I'm just going to go around table to table. I think being deliberate about what you're asking students to do and for what purpose is with each of the elements of the course can help to deal with some of that potential overload and drifting of attention.
Yeah,
well, Howard has it. Oh.
Go ahead.
No, great. No, I was going to say there's a question in the chat. It's right on this topic around tricks or any technology tools to help people to help monitor attention if people are stuck.
Yeah, it's something that I think those are in some way 2 different things. So, I mean, attention you can try to gauge. I think a kind of larger scale point I wanted to make around that ties in with that question is I think we all know and have seen it's just harder to get everyone engaged in this setting than it is around the table. There's no body language. There's no kind of sense of reward that people are looking at you as opposed to looking at someone else. You know, there's all these things are missing. And so we have to work extra hard in this environment to counter the kind of stale, sterile kind of nature of the online environment. So you have to be attentive to that yourself in doing that. If people are not engaged, it could be you're boring them, or it might not be their fault. So try to produce an environment that is engaging. The more interaction you have, the more you call on people. So I guess I'm saying one way to address this is to try to keep people from checking out by asking them to do something, and that's a big thing. When people are stuck, I mean, there's the example I mentioned, and maybe Maxwell has other ideas. That you can have a side channel. We've been working with a panel with a platform where it's all about different layers of communication and side conversations. And in some of the classes where we've been experimenting with that, it can be, if used properly and not in a distracting way, extremely useful for someone to be able to ask for help in a chat or in some other format that isn't interruptive, and get that answer. So I think that's, I'm not sure if that helps answer the question, but there's some other thoughts on that.
Maxwell,
I'm trying to think if there's anything on the technology front in particular. I mean, as John said, that the technology won't be the pedagogy, and it's important to separate those out. I think if people have experimented with kind of creating class Slack channels for communication, and those, the discussion boards are very active in these classes in the computer science department, and so I think that giving people the chance to just voice those questions. You could have a Google form or something of the sort that you could use. There's one professor is using a poll everywhere wall in class, and so as students complete something, they kind of say that they've completed it. And so she said it's a little weird that rather than knowing what's going on, I'm just watching polls move along. And so if somebody's stuck, you can kind of see that happening. So that's just a creative use of a technology that's not how it's supposed to be used. But it works in this setting. So hopefully those provide a little bit of inspiration.
Yeah, I think poll everywhere, different kinds of Google Forms, Qualtrics, surveys, frequent questions to students to ask, how's it going? Are you, do you like this? Do you not like that? The other point about this, which I think is everyone will experience, is when you start out working with a technology or with a setup, people address it one way. As they become more experienced, then their expectations and their way of using the methods and tools evolves. So you may need to start with some very simple, rigid thing, but you may be able to evolve to a more complicated use of the tools as you go on. And in a teaching situation, it's all about the culture and expectations of the environment you're creating.
Yeah. So in your spring study and research, what did you uncover around this, new online learning experience, and how that can be a way to frankly amplify diversity, equity, inclusion? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think there are two points there. One is in our experience with our own enrolled students, which is a diverse group in many ways. We saw much more starkly how different the backgrounds and home environments are for different people. So we had to address that in various ways. If someone has a good internet connection, that's one thing. If they have a poor internet connection, you have to build in ways for them to catch up and participate without that. If you ask people to turn on their cameras, some people have, they're in some very nice place and everybody's happy to see that. In somebody else's home, they may feel highly embarrassed about what you would see behind them. So you have to find ways to help people be comfortable and capable of participating, regardless of the circumstances they're in and regardless of the technology they have. So that's one big thing. And there is, I want to make sure we emphasize, there is research on almost all the topics we're talking about. There is good research on how to create an inclusive online environment what kind of signals you send to make people comfortable there, how many situations broadcast, subliminally or quietly, this is for one kind of person, it's not for another. You really have to address these things. And the more you can learn from people who've studied these things, the better. I think that's one element. The other is have we figured out how to scale education at lower cost through the last 6 months? I would say that that's not, entirely in yet. What almost all of us in education are trying to do is survive and get through this period without failure. And then towards the end, as we get a little more, our heads above water in some sense, I think we will find that many of the things we're learning now are going to be hugely useful. We are trying to cope with these problems. We are devising solutions. Our study is one effort to try to compare things that different instructors are doing and see what works best. We're not the only people doing that. It's the natural thing at a university to ask what's working and what isn't. So I'm sure there'll be lots of work on sorting out what we've learned. And I'm 100% certain we're not going to decide 2 years from now, all that online stuff was horrible. We're never going to use a computer. We're never going to use video again. That's not happening.
Is that your prediction? You're putting it like $1 million on that, right?
Whatever you want. I'll bet whatever you want. On the other hand, I don't think we're going to say, what campus? Nah, we love this online course. We're just going to do this. I'm going to teach from home forever. I don't ever want to see a student again in person. That's not happening either. The truth and the future, lies in between those extreme points. Different institutions will pick different places on that. And some of the things we're learning about how to use tools will help us scale education effectively. It's a little early and we're still learning a lot to say exactly, what will happen 5 years from now. I think most of us are going to, date periods in our life as pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. And I think higher education, K-12, will really be different, as a result of all the things we're doing and having to cope with and learning from doing that.
Yeah. So Maxwell, John offered, I heard there his prediction, some short and long term. What, Maxwell, do you have any to add here as we kind of wind down our fireside chat? How do you see the future?
I think related back to the last question you asked, I think making learning a lot more personal, as well as personalized. I think that's been a buzzword, but the personal element's the human piece. And being understanding of people on who you're learning with and who you're teaching, creating, there've been some, I was going to respond to the last question of, the importance of like a mastery-based approach where students can resubmit something until they show that they have, mastered the concept and are proficient. That makes a difference to a student who's in a rough setting and who is, feeling that pressure. And so I think the understanding of we've all gone online, we've realized how important our human connections are. I think that's the kind of piece that's going to be really critical going forward. I think that there's gonna, for the MOOC movement and these types of online environments to succeed, there's going to need to be a lot more opportunities for students to connect with one another and to kind of make those feelings a lot more personal and intimate with one another, and in a way that is not happening right now, and it will kind of show the importance of being in person, which might not be on a campus, right? There could be a lot of places where learning happens, and hopefully it continues to grow, so it's not just isolated to the campuses and school buildings, but is really spread wide and gives people a lot more access.
Great. Well, and kind of finally here before we move to one question from our attendees, call to action, John, Maxwell, for our audience, what's something they can do? How can they think about this? Any thoughts?
Well, one thing, let's be positive. Let's get through the situation and the challenges and try to learn from it. I think if we were in this situation 10 years ago, we would not have been able to succeed in the way that we have. So I think we have to be optimistic and acknowledge that even though, 6 hours of Zoom for a third grader is not what anyone would want, we are able to continue education like this. And I would look for what can we take away that's positive from this kind of forced experience that helps us achieve our true long-term goals. If our goals are better educational opportunity for more people in more ways, in ways that help suit them become more successful people, so let's use what we're learning now in order to improve education.
Great, Maxwell.
And yeah, always tough to follow, John. I think that there's a need for teachers to see, are there things you can get let go of, and are there ways in which you can be, try the same learning goals in new ways, and are there different ways that you might approach, take ideas that you would originally write off and see what doesn't serve you as much. And part of that's listening to the students. I think students have a lot to say. They're going through it. They'll know their experience better than anyone. Collecting feedback from them, working with them so that we can all go through this together, I think is really important, because I don't think there's a shortage of good ideas, but the implementation is hard, and that's where people working together, I think, really goes a long way.
Absolutely. Well, this was great, and so much more we could talk about. I know, Jessica, I think we're right at time. I don't know if we have an opportunity to throw out one more question from our audience around. I'm going to throw it out there. And earlier there was a question about global competitiveness, and if you worry at all about the U.S. getting super behind this year.
I certainly do.
I'm not qualified for that question personally.
Then John, we'll turn it. John, you can have the last word on this question.
Well, okay, I think that's absolutely, but I'm not sure that the educational problem is all of our global competitiveness issues. I think there are many important phenomena. Also, many other places are struggling with education in similar ways. At different points in the year, I think everyone is facing some difficulty. So I don't think that's the thing to focus on. I think if we can find ways to be successful ourselves and share our experiences with others, that's great. And so please, if you're involved in education or suffering through Zoom, more power to you. Try to listen to your students. Try if they're not interested in putting on their cameras, as somebody's asked, what's behind that? Are they uncomfortable? Can you make them more comfortable? Reach out to your students, ask what they're doing frequently, pay attention, and good luck, man, because this is a tough year for everybody.
Well, thank you so much. And that's a wrap. Great to meet and talk with you both.
Yeah, thank you, Christina, and thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you.